Thank you again for invitation to have a speech at conference. I want to begin precisely from the framing because the subject I will speak about today is the regulation of religious organizations in Ukraine in the context of Russian aggression. It sits exactly at the point where polarization is most dangerous and where solidarity is most needed. In connection with Russian aggression, the regulation of the activities of religious organizations, especially those associated with Russia, has received increased public and scholarly interest. The complexity of this issue has also been increased by the deliberate dissemination of polarized information spread through the media. Mm, my research, the last one research was about the regulation of the religious organizations. I was making it like because I'm the fellow of the UKRI Network Plus Shifting Global Polarities. It's such a network with many universities. So, my task today is to walk you through the legal, historical, and comparative dimensions of this problem so that we can discuss it not as a matter of slogans or either side, but as a matter of law, evidence, and democratic responsibility. I will organize my remarks into six parts, as you can see. First, I will explain the theoretical foundation of the whole debate, the idea of militant democracy, and the concept of securitization. Second, I will walk through the legal architecture that allows democratic states to restrict freedom of religion and freedom of speech, as well as the three criterion test that keeps such restrictions lawful. Third, I will describe what is actually happening to religious life in the Russian occupied territories of Ukraine, because that reality is the necessary background for everything that follows. Fourth, I will present a comparative analysis of how Ukraine, Estonia, Poland, and the United Kingdom have each responded to the aggressor state's instrumentalization of religion and the media. Fifth, I will turn to the discussion of the legitimacy, the objections raised against these measures and how they hold up against international human rights standards. And finally, I will offer conclusions on what I call the new paradigm of spiritual and informational sovereignty and what still needs to be done. And then I hope you will have some questions for me, and we will have the time for I will have the time for answers. So I can go to the part one. Yes, okay. So let me start a basic definition. Freedom in its broadest sense is the ability of a person to act according to their own interests and goals. It is the possibility of an independent choice between one decision and another. For that choice to be genuine, it must be made without coercion or threat, because coercion and threat nullify the value of the choice itself. Freedom of religion specifically is a natural, historically formed human right, the right to freely and openly recognize, follow, observe, or change one's religious or other convictions, and the corresponding obligation of the state to guarantee this to citizens and to religious organizations operating within the law. But here is a paradox that this conference exists to address. When there is a threat to the very existence of a person or of a nation, a threat to freedom or religion logically follows because a person under existential threat is deprived of the real possibility of freely professing or even recognizing their beliefs. And there is a second, equally important point. Freedom of religion is not only an individual matter. Through shared beliefs, communities self-identify and a collective identify forms. As the scholar Uliana Helberg has observed, when the state is under threat, the state defends its sovereignty while society defends its identity. Because identities shift under internal and external pressures and are never fixed, it becomes very difficult to draw a clean line between what is genuine threat and what is not. This is what is called the securitization of identity. Victoria Vasylenko the other researcher has described what happens next as a paradigmatic shift, a shift from a liberal system to a securitized one. In this shift, four things happen. An existential threat alters the hierarchy of rights. When the very existence of the state and the nation is at stake, the collective right to security takes priority over individual rights. Religious organizations can become instruments of hybrid warfare. When religious structures are used to promote the political interests of the aggressor state, they become a legitimate target for restrictive measures. Formal independence does not guarantee real autonomy. A declaration of separation from a mother church, so-called, means little of institutional ties persist in practice. And international human rights standards built for peacetime need rethinking because they prove insufficiently effective under conditions of existential war. Sorry. Okay. In the specific case of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically subordinate to the Moscow Patriarchate, this dynamic is very visible directly, because part of the clergy of this church voted the aggressor's actions. The church can simultaneously be, in Copenhagen school terms, both an object of securitization and a source of threat to the state. This is not a new dilemma. It was examined on the eve of the Second World War by Karl Löwenstein, who studied how democracies could counter the rise of fascism from within their own liberal institutions. Löwenstein proposed political and legal measures to protect democratic institutions from fascist abuse, and importantly, he acknowledged that virtually all of his recommendations restrict certain fundamental rights that are themselves important for democracy. But Lowenstein and those who followed him in developing the concept of militant democracy insisted that such restrictions concern only those who seek to penetrate the liberal democratic legal order in order to destroy it. Militant democracy is not directed at beliefs as such. It is directed at organized actors who instrumentalize freedoms in order to dismantle the constitutional order. The distinction between belief and instrumentalization is the single most important idea. I want you to take away from this first part of my remarks. Militant democracy uh, is not simply a political theory. It has a real normative foundation in international and national law, in the form of the possibility of departing from or restricting certain human rights under defined conditions. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights both state that freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and necessary to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Article 15 of the European Convention on Human... Yes,
I'm sorry,
yes.
because some of the students asking to you to speak slower.
Okay,
Not so
thank you, sorry.
fast because thank you.
Yes, okay. So, as I said, there are several norms in the international law that show the similar point of view, like Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also the Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, both state that freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and necessary to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Article 15 of the European Convention on Human Rights allows a state, in time of war or other public emergency threatening the life of the nation, to take measures derogating from its obligations under the conventions, to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation and provided such measures do not contradict the state's other international obligations. Certain rights, the right to life except in respect of lawful acts of war, the prohibition of torture, the prohibition of slavery, and the principle against retroactive punishment can never be derogated from. Freedom of religion itself, protected under Article 9, is not on that non-derogable list. Ukrainian constitutional law follows the same logic. Article 64 of the Constitution of Ukraine lists a series of rights that may not be restricted even under martial law. Among them, protection against discrimination, the presumption of innocence, and the right of parents to raise children according to their own beliefs. Freedom of religion, precisely because it is not on that list, is a right whose restriction becomes permissible when state sovereignty and collective identity are genuinely under threat. Freedom of speech is treated similarly. It encompasses the independent formation of one's own position, unconditional adherence to one's own beliefs, the open expression of that position, the freedom to change one's beliefs, the freedom to refuse to state a position publicly, and the freedom to receive, store, and disseminate information. Because these possibilities are, by their nature, relative rather than absolute. They too may be subject to restriction, but never unconditionally. This is where the European Code of Human Rights three criterion test become essential. That I will call the TCT. For a restriction on a fundamental right to be lawful, three conditions must be satisfied, as you can see here. First, legality. The law of state or state action must be accessible, predictable, and carried out for a legitimate legal purpose. Second, legitimate aim. The interference must correspond to one of the aims recognized by the European Convention: national security, territorial integrity, public order, crime prevention, protection of health or morals, or protection of the rights of others. Third, necessity of proportionality. The interference must reflect an urgent need and must be proportional to the legitimate aim being pursued. This is a test I will ask you to keep in mind throughout the rest of my remarks, because it is the yardstick against which every measure I'm about to describe in Ukraine, Estonia, Poland, and the United Kingdom must be judged if we want to distinguish a legitimate act of democratic self-defense from an act of arbitrary state power. I'll add one more piece of Ukrainian legal context here. On August 21st of 2025, President Volodymyr Zelensky signed the law on the principles of state policy of national memory of the Ukrainian people, which introduced legal definitions for phenomena connected to the destruction of Ukrainians and the struggle against them. Concepts such as the war for independence of Ukraine, historical anti-Ukrainian propaganda, and Russism. In parallel, the law on protection of constitutional order in the sphere of religious organizations activities fixed in law the concept of the Ruski Mir, Russian world, ideology, defined as a neo-colonial chauvinist concept that denies Ukraine's sovereignty and legitimates genocides, and recorded the support given by the Russian Orthodox Church to the aggression against Ukraine, on the basis of which its activity as a factual accomplice to war crimes was banned. Before I turn to the comparative legal analysis, I want to ground this discussion in reality, because abstract debates about restricting freedoms mean something quite different once we look honestly at what freedom of religion looks like in the other side of the front line. Analysts assess the implementation of freedom of religion at three levels: the institutional level, the legal conditions for religious organizations, to register and operate. The community level, how safe the environment is for religious community, and what pressure or persecution it experiences. On the individual level, the right of a person to freely and safely profess or not profess a religion, alone or together with others, privately or publicly. In the temporary occupied territories, the Constitution of Ukraine and the law on freedom of conscience are simply suspended. Religious life is organized according to Russian Federation law, which imposes strict restrictions and requires subordination to the occupying secular authorities. Religious organizations such as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the Knights of Columbus, and Caritas have been accused of distributing extremist literature, storing ammunition, or engaging in diversionary activity under laws regulating so-called extremism. According to the U.S. Department of State 2022 report on international relations freedom for Russia, authorities have continued to investigate, detain, imprison, torture, physically abuse, and seize the property of persons because of their religious belief or their membership in groups labeled extremist, terrorist, or undesirable. Among them, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Majlis of Crimean Tatars, Hizb ut-Tahrir, follower of the Turkish theologian Said Nursi, the Church of Scientology, Falun Gong, and multiple evangelical Protestant groups. In the occupied parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has been officially banned outright. Occupying authorities do not stop at banning organizations. They also expropriate their property. Places of worship have been converted into ammunition warehouses, shooting ranges, military headquarters, morgues, and concert halls for Russian servicemen. As of early 2025, over 630 prayers, building and cult places around Ukraine, churches, mosques, synagogues, and prayer houses has been destroyed or damaged by Russian shellings. 67 clergy members of various confessions have been killed. More than 30 religious figures have been or still are held in illegal detention, where they have experienced physical violence, mock executions, and coercion to cooperate with the occupiers. And alongside these violations, there is one more dimension I want to highlight because it speaks directly to the polarized media coverage. Name the title of my remarks: the imposition of the Ruski Mir ideology itself. To justify Russia's war, the Moscow Patriarchate promotes a quasi-religious imperial ideology in which the war is presented as sacred, a struggle against a satanic West. This ideology was formally articulated in the order of the 25th World Russian People's Council, the present and future of the Russian world, approved under the chairmanship of Patriarch Kirill on March 27th, on 2024, and unanimously supported by 488 delegates, including more than 30 bishops and more than 60 priests of the Russian Orthodox Church, alongside representatives of Russian state power and society. This is not a phraseological position. It is an instrument of state policy propagated through religious platforms, including in the occupied territories of Ukraine. So when we ask later in this talk whether restricted the activity of an institution connected to this church is a violation of religious freedom or a defense of it, I ask you to hold this picture in mind: destroyed churches, murdered priests, and an ideology of conquest dressed in religious language. So I will go later to also, this is what I told you, to my research. So this is okay. So I will now walk through how four democracies, Ukraine, Estonia, Poland, and the United Kingdom, have each responded to the instrumentalization of religion and media by the Russian state. What is striking when you place these four cases side by side is that they share common diagnosis: that Russian propaganda and the political use of the Russian Orthodox Church constitute informational weapons, not another opinion, even though their methods of response differ substantially. So I will start with Ukraine. Ukraine has developed the most comprehensive and systematic model, which reflects the direct and existential character of the threat it faces. Its strategy spans culture, politics, and religion, forming a unified policy that can be described as informational and spiritual derussification. Since independence, Ukraine's Orthodox landscape has been marked by institutional fragmentation. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically subordinate to Moscow, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. In late 2018, the latter two merged into the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which received a Tomos of Autocephaly from the Ecumenical Patriarchate in January 1219. Because the 1991 law on freedom of conscience and religious organization separates church from state, and because there is, legally speaking, no single unified church in Ukraine, but only individual registered religious organizations, parishes and dioceses, the state initially had no single instrument through which to address ties to the aggressor state as a whole. An early legislative attempt requires religious organizations whose managing center is located in an aggressor state to reflect that affiliation in their name. But because of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was not named specifically, its organizations did not change their names. The decisive step came after more than 2 years of consultation and preparation on August 20, 2024, with the law on protection of constitutional order in the sphere of religious organizations activities. This law banned the activity of the Russian Orthodox Church as an organization that supports and agitates for aggression against Ukraine, and it established 7 precise criteria of affiliation for determining whether a religious organization operating in Ukraine is, in substance, part of that banned structure, including whether its leaders sit in the governing bodies of the foreign organizations, whether that foreign organization can influence its management decisions, and whether it appoints or approves that organization's leadership or statute. The procedure that follows is judicial, not administrative. The State Service of Ukraine for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience, DES in Ukrainian, identifies organizations showing signs of affiliation, issues a third-day order to bring the organization into compliance, and only if that order is not followed does it file a lawsuit for the termination of the organization's activity to be decided by a court, not by a DES. On August 27, 2025, DES recognized the Kyiv metropolis of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as affiliated with a banned foreign religious organization. And on September the 3rd, 2025, the Sixth Administrative Court of Appeal opened proceedings in this case. We don't have now the decision yet. Ukraine has also pursued administrative measures, terminating lease agreements for religious use of state property, including at the Kyiv Patriarchate Lavra, and has conducted personal vetting of hierarchs, uncovering, for instance, Russian citizenship held by a metropolitan of Chernivtsi and Bukovina. And terminating Ukrainian citizenship for several hierarchs found to hold Russian passports. In parallel, Ukraine has built a multi-layered barriers against Russian informational weapons, banning the retransmission of Russian television channels, maintaining a list of aggressor state service whose distribution is prohibited, deploying telecommunication infrastructure in border regions specifically to block Russian broadcast signals, banning the import of books from Russia and Belarus, and banning films and music that popularize Russian state symbols. The Security Service of Ukraine has exposed more than 60 clergy members working for Russia, described by a former head of the service as former head Maluk as the task of cleaning of FSB agent in Kessox. And crucially, this legal architecture enjoys strong public support. Research by the Rozumkov Center found that 79% of Ukrainians support the principle that religious organizations operating in Ukraine cannot have a managing center in a state committing armed aggression against Ukraine, and 80% support the principle that propaganda of the Ruski Mir ideology is grounds for banning a religious organization. This is how situation in Ukraine is, and I will go now to Estonia. Estonia's approach is shaped by its position as a border state with a significant Russian-speaking minority, around 26 to 27% of the population, and it has pursued a proactive, strict model of protecting what I would call religious and informational security. Estonia, like Ukraine, has both a church historically tied to Moscow, the Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, with roughly 170,000 members, 37 communities, and 81 priests, and an autonomous church under the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church, with roughly 30,000 members, so much less. The unity between the Moscow-affiliated church and the Russian Orthodox Church was on display from the very first days of the full-scale invasion. The Moscow-affiliated church published Patriarch Kirill's February 24th, 2022 speech asserting the unity of Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian peoples, a speech that denied Ukrainian sovereignty. Public outrages followed, and its metropolitan initially signed a joint appeal condemning Russia's action, only to refuse, weeks later, to recognize Russia as an aggressor in a subsequent interview. Estonia has responded with a series of escalating measures. Excuse me. In January 2024, it did not renew the residence permit of that metropolitan, treating his public support for Kremlin actions as a threat to national security. Estonia's interior minister has proposed to parliament that the Russian Orthodox Church itself be declared an organization supporting terrorism. And on April 10th, 2025, Estonia's parliament adopted a law requiring religious organizations to terminate ties to foreign centers that pose a threat to national security, giving organizations 2 months to comply, with the president simultaneously referring the law to the state court for constitutional review. Itself a sign of a functioning rule of law process rather than an arbitrary ban. On the media and information side, Estonia's Consumer Protection and Technical Regulatory Authority had, as of May 2023, blocked 195 domains and roughly 50 television channels, including major Russian state outlets, for spreading military propaganda and incitement to hatred, and it has the power to fine hospitality and care establishments that will continue broadcasting banned channels. Estonia also hosts NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn and created one of the world's first data embassies in Luxembourg to preserve critical state data and registries against the risk of cyber attack. And despite all of this, Estonia maintains one of the highest levels of internet freedom in the world, a Freedom House score 93 out of 100 in 2023. Which tells you something important. Security measures and genuinely free information environments are not mutually exclusive. Although the ruling is an abstract review of the law's general constitutionality rather than a verdict of any specific organization, the case has been argued throughout with explicit reference to the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church, the renamed Moscow Patriarchate structure, and its ties to the Puhtitsa convent, Estonia's Internal Security Service reported in April that the church's rebranding has not altered its subordinate to Moscow. The decision therefore supplies exactly the kind of judicial confirmation my remarks pointed to as pending. Estonia's model, like Ukraine's, rests on a court-tested standard of necessity and proportionality rather than executive fiat. Even as six dissenting justices concerned about legal clarity are reminded that this balance remains genuinely consistent within Estonia's own highest court. By now, I suppose, the last month, on May, Estonia's High Court has approved the right to Estonian Parliament to ban Russian Orthodox Church and to ask religious organizations mm, to finish their connections with the Russian Orthodox Church. Poland. Poland's response focuses almost entirely on the media and informational sphere, without adopting comparable legislative measures against religious organizations. Poland was among the first EU states to remove Russian state broadcasters, RT, RT documentary Russia 24, Atar Planeta, and Pierwszy Kanal from its broadcasting register on national security grounds, and its internal security agency has blocked access to more than a dozen pro-Kremlin websites spreading war disinformation. Poland has also blocked and demonized Sputnik and RT content on YouTube within its territory. Poland treats informational aggression explicitly as part of the military conflict. In May 2024, it resumed the work of a state commission examining 2 decades of Russian and Belarusian influence on its internal security, added major private media groups to a list of strategic companies whose sale requires intelligence service approval, precisely to prevent hostile actors from purchasing influential media, and has committed billions of zloty to cyber defense in a year when Russia cyber attacks against Poland exceeded 100,000. Polish services also monitor influence operations aimed at splitting Polish-Ukrainian relations, including narratives spread on channels alleging that Poland's assistance to Ukraine is intended to Polonize its western regions, Ukrainian regions. Poland has also barred entry to Russian propagandists and journalists and has used its position within the EU Council to promote counter-disinformation priorities at the European level. Unfortunately, we can now state that there is another attempt to divide Ukrainian-Polish solidarity by fueling anti-Ukrainian sentiment in Poland due to complex historical issues by now. And we don't know where will we go with that issue. Also, about the UK, Britain's model relies on an independent regulator, judicial precedent, and targeted personnel and corporate sanctions rather than sweeping bans. On March 18, 2022, Ofcom, the UK's communications regulator, revoked RT's broadcasting license, finding the broadcaster inappropriate and improper in light of, among other factors, RT's relationship with the Russian state. Ofcom also formally pressed Meta and TikTok to restrict access to RT and Sputnik content in the UK. Legislatively, the Online Safety Act 2023 places obligations on technology companies to identify and remove state disinformation from foreign actors seeking to undermine democracy. Britain has also used the courts. Its High Court upheld financial sanctions against a British blogger, Graham Phillips, who glorified Russian aggression, ruling that protecting Ukraine's territorial integrity and Britain's own democratic order provided a legitimate basis for restricting his rights. In October 2024, Britain sanctioned the Russian companies behind the Doppelganger disinformation network, which spread deepfakes and fake news across Europe. The Economic Crime, Transparency and Enforcement Act 2022 and the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act 2023 target the concealment of real asset ownership used to finance Russian influence, and the government has reviewed the role of Russian capital in universities and charitable foundations. Finally, the National Security Act 2023 creates new offenses for foreign interference in democratic processes, and Britain actively studies and shares intelligence with partners, recognizing Ukraine notably as the most advanced state in the world at countering Russian informational warfare. What I want you to notice across these four cases in the pattern. Ukraine and Estonia legislate directly against canonical ties and affiliated structure. Britain and Poland regulate through all their communications authorities and through targeted sanctions. But in all four cases, the object of restriction is not belief. It is an organizational or broadcasting structure judged to be instrumentalized by a hostile state. So I will turn to this three-part test or three-criterion test. Now, I will turn to this question about more directly. Are these measures a threat to fundamental freedoms or a legitimate defense of them? So we have this three-criterion test. So Ukraine law explicitly states that it is adopted and implemented in the interest of national and public security and the protection of the rights and freedoms of others, satisfying the first criterion on its face. On legitimate aim, the necessity of these measures across all four states is grounded in documented, proven threats from the Russian state in both the media and religious spheres. This is not a hypothetical justification. And critically, none of these measures actually prevents anyone from receiving information or professing a religion of their choice. Ukraine and Estonia, despite having the most similar legal frameworks concerning religious organizations, do not ban any creed or belief as such. Within legal and democratic procedures, they seek only to address the security implications of institutional structures, satisfying the necessity and proportionality criteria as well. But let me address honestly the strongest criticism that have been raised in the scholarly literature, because a serious analysis owes them a serious answer. The first criticism, the criteria of affiliation themselves, the concern that Ukraine's law defines affiliation using the Russian Orthodox Church's own documents rather than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's self-identification, means that if the Russian Church continues by its own status to claim the Ukrainian Church as part of itself, the Ukrainian state can use that claim as grounds for sanctions regardless of what the Ukrainian organization itself says about its own status. This is a real concern, but the legislature addresses it directly by giving religious organizations the explicit opportunity to declare their separateness from the Moscow Patriarchate, which nullifies the ability of the foreign church to unilaterally define the affiliation of Ukrainian religious organization against that organization's own wishes. The second criticism concerns the rights of concepts used in the law, terms like influence, blessings, or spiritual ties, which could in principle be applied with excessive administrative discretion. This concern also has real grounds, and I will return to it in my conclusions as an area needing continued attention and refinement. The third, perhaps more serious criticism concerns collective responsibility. The worry that a law like this punishes an entire institution for the actions of certain individuals within it, which would be inconsistent with international standards requiring that sanctions target specific unlawful conduct rather than religious identity as such. Here I want to precise about what the law actually does and does not do. It does not ban a religious community or a religious identity. It regulates only the legal existence of an organization, a legal entity found to be connected to the aggressor state. It does not cancel human rights during wartime. A special legal regime applies, but only a court, not an administrative body, can decide whether to terminate a religious organization's activity. The law does not ban religious organizations' activity in Ukraine as a category, nor the activity of unregistered religious community, and this is important. It applies not only to the Russian Orthodox Church specifically, but to any religious organization found to support aggression against Ukraine. It is, in other words, a general standard rather than a targeted decree against one specific confession. I would also point you to the broader jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights on freedom of expression during armed conflict, which has consistently held that the press does not have unlimited license to cross boundaries, protecting vital state interests such as national security or territorial integrity, or to incite violence, riot, or crime. And that competent state authorities may take adequate measures, including measures of a criminal legal character, provided the necessity criterion is respected. There is one more dimension of public legitimacy worth noting, because it speaks directly to the polarization theme of this conference. Support in Ukraine for banning the Russian Orthodox Church runs as high as 74%, but with an internally interesting contradiction. Part of that support comes from citizens who do not consider the organization in question to be a genuine religious organization at all, but rather as a propaganda hub. In other words, for a large share of the public, this is understood not as a closing down an informational, not as a matter of religious freedom versus religious restriction, but as a matter of identifying and closing down an informational front operating on Ukrainian soil under religious cover. I would also I say for balance that the research underlying this analysis has documented a pattern of self-censorship among Ukrainian media workers between 2019 and 2023, journalists avoiding certain topics out of fear of being accused of disloyalty. A reminder that the health of an information environment under wartime pressures needs to be watched from more than one direction. I will go now to the conclusion. The core argument I have presented to you today is this. Under conditions of existential threat, the collective right to security becomes the prerequisite without which the realization of any individual freedom is possible at all. This is not a rejection of liberal values, it is paradoxically their defense. Malicious actors should not be given the opportunity to exploit what they perceive as the vulnerability of Western democracies, their, their sensitivity to human rights, in order to dismantle those very democracies from within. Ukraine's restriction of the Russian Orthodox Church's influence through the law number 3894, which I was talking about, should be understood as an instrument of spiritual decolonization, directed not at faith or ritual, but at institutional belonging to an organization that has served as an accomplice to war crimes. The high level of public support for these measures, 74% for the church ban, 80% against the Ruski Mir ideology specifically, reflects a genuine democratic mandate under wartime conditions and the fact that organizational termination proceeds only through judicial review, under standards of necessity and proportionality, in what distinguishes Ukraine's approach from the arbitrariness practiced by the aggressor in the territories it occupies. And I want to stress again, there is no restriction of the community's religion itself. The community can continue to meet its own spiritual needs. Across all four countries, which I have discussed, we see a shared understanding that Russian propaganda and the political use of the Russian Orthodox Church must be treated as an informational weapon rather than as another point of view, even as the specific instruments differ. Ukraine's combination of legal bans, counterintelligence work against clergy connected to hostile services, and control filtering of Russian media products, Poland's reliance on administrative displacement and intelligence counteraction, alongside treating Belarus as a proxy of a proxy in the international struggle. Estonia's proactive regulatory and technical model, blocking domains and channels while building digital embassies for state data resilience, and its parallel move to severe canonical ties to Moscow, and Britain's emphasis on regulatory fit and proper standards, new foreign interference offenses, and personal financial sanctions against its own citizens who spread aggressors' propaganda. I do not want to leave you with the impression that this system is finished or beyond improvement. The research points to several genuine areas for further work. This is a need for active engagement beyond Ukraine's own partners with countries across Africa, South America, and Asia, where Russian narratives often go unanswered. A fit and proper mechanism for media ownership, as applies in Britain through Ofcom, could offer a more preventive response to security threats elsewhere. Effective use of the EU's Digital Service Act could help legitimize blocking harmful content on global platforms such as Telegram and TikTok across Europe. And because Ukraine has adopted the most far-reaching model, a direct legislative mechanism targeting religious organizations, it is especially important to continue strengthening the methodology of religious studies expertise used in the determinations precisely so as to avoid any appearance of collective responsibility and to keep refining concepts like affiliation, influence, and Ruski Mir so that they do not become sources of legal uncertainty or excessive administrative discretion. Effective resistance to this kind of hybrid influence in the end requires more than bans. It requires building a genuinely new architecture of resilience, one in which the speed of technical and regulatory response is matched by the depth of legal justification and by an ongoing commitment to open democratic dialogue. That, I think, is also the truest form of solidarity this conference can build. Not simply solidarity in feeling with those under attack, but solidarity in the shared, disciplined work of getting the law right. Legal enough, aimed at a legitimate purpose, and no more than necessary, so that our defense of democratic societies never becomes indistinguishable from what we are defending them against. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and to our discussion.